you could be with us as we begin our summer series. Would you like some water?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's $1.
Okay. You see Leah afterwards.
Okay, here you go.
There we go.
Hey, we're really glad you all could be with us tonight. We're kicking off our summer series, and Jonathan and I wanted to do this initial lesson together as we introduce about engaging in our culture. And what we'd like to do tonight is just lay a foundation for the individual lessons that are going to be discussed over the next several weeks. We'll kind of tell you about what's coming next Wednesday night, and the speaker who's going to be with us when we get toward the end of our time here in the Bible class. But we want to begin and try to introduce things tonight as best we can. We're very excited about this this series. As I said in the email today, I think this will probably be the most relevant and maybe the most important of these summer series that we have conducted. And I think as we get into the subject matter, as we begin to look at them and talk about them, in particular with the people that we've asked to come and to deal with the individual topics, I think that will be borne out, and you'll see that that is in fact true. You know, the world in which we live is much different than the world in which I grew up. That would, I think, go without saying. I grew up in a world of Andy and Barney and Mayberry and Ricky and Lucy and Robin Laura Petrie. Your kids don't have any idea who Robin Laura Petrie are. But that was a different time and a different world. Those days are gone. And those days are not coming back. And lamenting those days doesn't do any of us any good at all. But you know, the fact is that if you're of a generation just younger than mine and you have kids, you probably say the exact same thing. You probably say as well, you know, this is a different world than I grew up in. And you would be right about that. The touchstones would be different, but the reality is the same, that the world has changed. We shouldn't be naive about that. And we shouldn't be naive, even for those of us, if you're my generation, in the baby boomer generation, we look back with a lot of nostalgia at that time and what the world was like. But I will tell you, if you could draw back the curtain, if we could have drawn back the curtain then, we would have seen dishonesty and immorality, and we would have seen broken marriages and neglected kids, and we certainly would have seen some of the racial things that we talked about Sunday, and we would have seen church divisions and squabbles. And so we tend to remember things in an idyllic kind of way. It's why Solomon in Ecclesiastes 7:10 said, "Do not say, 'Why were the former days better than these?' You do not inquire wisely about that." We tend to remember the high points and the good things, and we tend to overlook the things that sometimes really were a little bit under the surface. But let's also be real honest. It feels different in 2022. I think everybody would acknowledge that, wouldn't you? That it feels different today. And so when I read in my Bible and hear Paul say in 2 Timothy 3:13 that evil men and seducers will grow worse and worse, deceiving and being deceived, it's almost like he was looking through the telescope of time and seeing 2022 America, because it just feels different, or at least it does to me. I mean, you think about some of the things, you know, social media that really should be used for such good things, and in some ways has become somewhat of a plague today. Our kids and grandkids are confronted with immorality on a scale that, I mean, I couldn't even imagine. We couldn't even imagine when we were young. Politics on both sides of the aisle has become toxic. The aberrancy of transgenderism is being portrayed to us as being normal. Family's been redefined so many times that the biblical definition is lost anymore on most. And the church, the Lord's church, is really considered to be just irrelevant, antiquated, irrelevant, not really in touch with our world. And that's why we're doing this series. And that we wanted to just say at the beginning. That's why we're doing this series, because we need those touchstones that really do matter. There's a statement in the Old Testament that I've quoted many, many times. It's 1 Chronicles 12:32 that says about the men of Issachar, that the men of Issachar understood the times and knew what Israel should do. And I think that's such an important statement, because it says on the one hand that they had their eyes open about the world in which they lived, and secondly, they realized that the world in which they lived was going to affect the spiritual life of the nation. And so they knew what Israel should do. Not just that they should do something knee-jerk, a knee-jerk reaction, but they knew what Israel should do in a proper way, in a right way, as they lived in their world. Now, this concept's in the Bible as well, particularly in the New Testament. Jonathan, where is that?
Yeah, you absolutely see that at least in the book of Revelation, as I think about it, and the idea of responding the right way to your culture. And I really like that idea of the men of Issachar, seeing where they lived and responding the right way, and not doing some kind of knee-jerk thing, but really responding in a way that's effective and wise. When John wrote those letters to the 7 churches in Asia, you'll notice that to each particular church in each particular culture, he writes a different letter. And just think how tone-deaf it would have been for John to write the same letter to Thyatira that he wrote to Smyrna. These churches that are dealing with such different issues and are going to be battling such different things in the future, they need different responses. And that's not to say that the truth is relative and that one thing is true for one church and not true for another, but it's to say that some messengers are more effective. And understanding what you're battling helps you respond in the right way to the situation that's ahead of you. And so if we are going to think about, how can I be a Christian in this culture? And how do I respond in the right way to the cultural shift that I see, to the way that the wind is blowing? That begins by understanding exactly what kind of culture we're in. You know, we don't just need a pat answer, which is very easy to do, right? We could say, well, everybody, they need more Jesus, they need more Bible. Well, we can do a little bit better than that, right? We need to understand, first of all, what are the problems with our culture? What specifically is going on in the culture we inhabit? And so that's the first question I wanted to pose to you, Don, is how would you describe our modern culture? What specifically are we dealing with? And just so we won't be accused of hand-wringing, let's start with the positive. What are some really positive things about the culture we have here in America?
Well, there are a lot of positive things, and I think we're we're wrong to look at our world and just see it through negative eyes, because there are a lot of good things about our culture, particularly our American culture. One of the things that we talked about Sunday morning, I think, is one of our strong suits. That is, we are a nation of diversity. We're not a cookie cutter people. We are not in a society. We're not under a form of government where everybody has to do, think, act exactly the same. We have racial diversity, national diversity, geographic, political, educational, vocational. We are an extraordinarily diverse people. We are an extremely compassionate people. Americans are known for their compassion. I mean, think about it. Every single week you will hear on the news, every single week you'll hear on the news, in the local news at least, somebody be referred to as a good Samaritan. Good Samaritan stopped and helped somebody. Some good Samaritans came to their rescue. And they don't have to say, and by the way, here's what a good Samaritan means. It's a reference in the Bible that you're probably not familiar with. Everybody knows what that is. Everybody knows what a good Samaritan is. And that's still a part of our culture, that we tend to people, we care for people in whatever that circumstance may be, whether they're hungry or disabled or whatever.
Yeah, I think absolutely you see a lot of that when you think about, especially how far we've come with the way that we treat mental illness in this culture. I think that's a big, huge positive mark in our favor. And also the way that we treat the hungry and the orphans. I think this stat is right. I think the truth is that for every child put up for adoption, there are 46 families willing to adopt that child, which is just remarkable to think about. Find me another culture that can have that same stat, that is that compassionate toward those who don't have or who are less fortunate. You can't find it.
You know anybody in that circumstance?
What circumstance?
One of the 46 families.
Well, I mean, we're one of the 46 families.
I know you are.
There are other ones in this audience, too.
There are other
Absolutely.
ones as well. That's right. But this is exactly right. It's exactly right. We are a nation that do our best to take care of our own. We're a nation of laws. I mean, we're a nation that still values justice. I know in our pledge, we talk about liberty and justice for all, and we struggle sometimes with that justice for all business. I think we'd all acknowledge that it's not, justice is not always blind, but I'll tell you, our system of justice is, I think, far superior to whatever may be in second place. And we're a generous people. America's an extraordinarily generous nation. I read that last year in America, in 2021 in America, it's estimated that Americans volunteered 8.7 billion, with a B, hours of time in serving other people, whether for organizations, charities, friends, churches, whatever it may be. And beyond that, in 2021, $410 billion were given by Americans to various charities. Now, sometimes that's a mason jar by a cash register where you're putting in dollars for somebody to help medical bills. But sometimes that's people like Bill and Melinda Gates, whose marriage dissolved last year. But Bill and Melinda Gates and their charitable foundation that as of last year have given somewhere in the vicinity of $50 billion, again with a B, $50 billion to charity. And so, we're an extraordinarily generous people.
Yeah. You can see that in a smaller scale, too. And the very fact that we live in a society where GoFundMe is a thing is just amazing to me. That I can write my story online, post it online, so strangers can read it, and then they just start giving me money. Like that is so cool that that's actually a thing where people actually give money to that.
Is this a thing that I don't know about? Y'all be checking your email tonight.
There you go. Get Heather to set you up a GoFundMe.
That's it. Well, she would have to, or Jocelyn won. No clue with that.
So there are a lot of good things about our culture, but that's not why we're here tonight. What are some of the problems that we're dealing with specifically here in America?
Yeah. Well, I think everybody would have their own list of that. To me, one of the most troubling things that's going on in our society, in our nation, is how very polarized we are. I think most people would agree with that that's not a good thing. We are extraordinarily polarized. We're polarized politically, we understand that. That has infected Christians in so many places. We talk Sunday morning about racial divisions. I tell you what bothers me about that is that we can't have a discussion anymore. Does that bother anybody else? That we don't seem to be able to discuss anything. That everything seems to be an either-or situation. It has to be all one way and 0% of the other. And I don't think that's a healthy thing for us. But we hear that all the time. All the time. If, for example, in 2020, when somebody, if somebody would have said, you know what, I can understand why people were motivated to say Black Lives Matters. Well, then you don't support the police. No, that's not what I said. That's not what I said at all. Well, you don't believe all lives matters. No, that's not really what I said. Or just think about what's gone on in the last 3 weeks in America. And if you say to somebody, maybe this would be a good time for us to think about some of our gun laws, and, well, you don't believe in the Second Amendment. No, I kind of love the Second Amendment. I didn't say that. But we've gotten to a point where we can't even have a conversation. If you say, you know what, some of the images of the little tiny children down at the border where their parents are trying to get, and they're heartbreaking to see the circumstance those kids, not by their own choice, are in. Oh, well, you don't believe we should secure our borders. No, I didn't say that. I'm just saying there's a situation that maybe we could talk about. But we can't talk about anything in America anymore. If you say anything, somebody's going to take it, and it has to be all one way or the other. I don't really believe that's healthy for us. And then there's so many other things. William James, the philosopher, once said that there is no idea so absurd, but if repeated often enough, will eventually come to be believed. And I think that's what's happened to us morally and ethically in America. That things have been repeated so many times that now in America, they just kind of naturally come to be believed. And so multiculturalism in regard to faith, one religion is just as good as another. The bumper stickers you see coexist. Or today was the beginning of quote-unquote Pride Month. What's happened with homosexuality in America, that to oppose that in any way, you're considered just to be an absolute bigot. Marriage should be between any two committed people. evolution is a fact. Creation is now a myth. Those things in our culture. A lot of that's come about because of what's been happening for years and years and years now, and that's relativism, the idea that there's no real absolute truth, that all truth is relative, that what's true for you may not be true for me, and vice versa.
Well, and we usually confine that conversation about relativism to just that evolutionary, evidentiary kind of discussion. Is there a God or is there not a God? Is there truth or is there not truth? But in our culture, you can see that play out in the everyday decisions that people make. In our culture, we live in a time that many people have, where many people believe in something called expressive individualism. And that's a term that's highly technical and it's really big. But basically what it means is that your feelings rule everything. That inside of you, you are this, you have these particular feelings, you are this particular person, and that may or may not match what's going on the outside, but your highest aim in life is to express that inner individuality that you have, whether it agrees with what you physically have or not. And really, it comes down to the idea that your feelings matter more than anything else. It doesn't matter what science says, it doesn't matter what reason says or rationality says. What matters is how you feel. It doesn't matter what the facts are. What matters more than anything else is how I feel. And ultimately, how I feel, well, that's reality. And that's the situation that we live in. That's how you get statements like, well, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body. That's relativism, right? That's my feelings matter more than everything else. And you see that go all throughout our culture in so many different ways.
Yeah, you see that in religion, in particular in emotionalism. One of the reasons why feelings and emotions are so prominent in so much of religion today is because there's no accountability to that. There's no objective standard that you tie that to. And so that certainly has become a problem. And, that list can go on and on. We've come to believe that the environment, we've come to believe that animals are just as important as a human being. I don't want to abuse the environment. I certainly am not going to abuse an animal, but there's a difference between an animal and a human being. And we've kind of lost that distinction as well. Again, it just seems to me like the world feels a little different right now. Like it's a little more off kilter maybe than it has been in the past. The world moves. It always does. Again, if you go back to 2 Timothy 3:13, evil men and impostors grow worse and worse. And so the world is not static. It doesn't stay in the same place. It moves. And think about that. In the last 10 years, think about it in the last 20 years. Think about how far the world has moved from the kind of pinnings of morality that used to hold us in place a little bit. We're kind of now where Isaiah talked in Isaiah chapter 5, where he said, bad things happen to a culture, to a nation, to a world when you put darkness for light and bitter for sweet, and darkness for light, bitter for sweet. There's one more. What is the other one?
You're talking about Isaiah here. You got me.
Okay.
Where's
Carson, what's the other one? Oh, man, I was hoping my intern would bail me out there.
You went right over Pharaoh Jenkins. Come on.
No, because I want to be able to. I want to have the rest of our time. If we ask Pharaoh, he's going to show us slideshows of Israel that will illustrate it.
There you go.
That. Yeah. Evil for good. Evil for good.
Amen to that.
Well, that's our world. That's our world, and so that's kind of where we are. So maybe, Jonathan, the thing to talk about with that is how that world, that modern culture, clashes with the biblical culture, the Christian culture that we embrace.
Yeah, and I think ultimately what it comes down to is two fundamental worldviews, because that's what we have in our society. And when you think about the structure of our nation and how it was built and the idea of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, it's easy to see how worldly-minded individuals could have taken this and run in the direction that they did. But really, we have one group, the mass of American society, who says, I am my own authority, right? Which is actually different. If you talk to, somebody from Chinese culture, they're not going to feel that way. They very much recognize the government is our authority in this country. But in America, we say, I'm my own authority, right? You can't tell me what to do. You can't impede on my personal happiness. I decide what I do with my life and my body. I pursue happiness however I see fit. which is honestly why you get such a controversy when it comes to abortion. Did you know that there are actually people who are pro-choice, pro-abortion, who would affirm that the baby in the womb is literally a human child, but you have every right to terminate it because you have a right to do what you want with your body. In fact, the argument is shifting to that way because of the science that we see when we can look inside the womb. It's undeniable that it's a baby and it acts like a human. And so the argument really is shifting from, oh, that's just a useless clump of cells, to no one gets to tell you what you do with your body. And that's really the argument now. And that's at large what our society does. I am my own authority, and no one can tell me how to use my body. And then you have God's people, and ultimately our worldview is God is our authority, right? Romans chapter 6 and verse 13, do not go on presenting yourself as instruments of unrighteousness, but instruments of righteousness to God, right? We are supposed to use our body because we belong to God, and we've been bought with a price, and we're supposed to glorify God in our body. That's what 1 Corinthians 6 says. And so we look at our lives and we say, no, we are not our own authority. God is our authority. And our bodies are used for His purposes. I don't get to determine what I do with my life or how I pursue my happiness. I let God do that. And that's fundamentally the clash that we have in our culture. I am my own authority. God is my authority. Which side do you really stand on?
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's that has led to a change in the definition of some of the words, For example, words like tolerance. That definition has certainly changed. I've said before in sermons, when I was a boy, my mom and dad taught me to be tolerant of people with whom we disagreed religiously or about other things. But by tolerance, they meant that I treated them with respect, even though we may disagree. That it's that business of understanding everybody's made in the image of God, and so you treat them with respect. And now, of course, tolerance has taken on a completely different meaning than that. It's the idea that if you say anything critical at all, that you have become intolerant, and usually there are a host of other adjectives that go along with that are
That's right.
that are not the best. And so that again, but it comes down to what you just said. It's that view of the world.
Absolutely. And so I guess we have to ask ourselves the question, we're looking at two fundamentally different worldviews. And we're struggling with that because we see the world going off in this direction because that's the way they see the world. And we're trying to stay over here and go in this direction because that's the way we see the world. And that can lead to this clash of cultures. And the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what are some bad ways to respond to that? What are some ways that the devil wants us as Christians to respond to this culture? What are some ineffective ways of responding, I guess is the right way to ask?
Well, I think there's a whole litany of things that everybody in this room would immediately think of. I mean, we're not going to plow any new ground here with that. I think everybody in this room would, if you were thinking about wrong ways for Christians to respond to our culture, most everybody's going to have the same list. It's going to begin with, well, wrong number one would be to conform to it. I mean, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And in that you prove what is the good and acceptable and perfect will of God. And so the first wrong way, of course, would just to conform, to drift with the cultural tide. John said in 1 John 4:1, test things, test the spirits, see if these things are of God. And that's a good filter. That's what we need to be, putting things in our culture through to see whether or not they're worthy of accepting. But sometimes that conformity is almost, it's not really isolation. It's almost hiding really who we are. It's going to work, it's going to school, and it's just not doing anything to let other individuals know that you're a Christian, that you're a person of faith. And it would be with things like evangelism, that mindset. Who are you to tell me what to believe, or who are you to tell me that I should believe something different than what I do? But again, the problem with that, Romans 12:1, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed. Romans 12:1, by the way, that verse, it does have a context. And the context of that verse is the first 11 chapters of the book of Romans. Because everything that Paul has said in the book of Romans, 1 through 11, is he's given the most rich, full treatise on redemption through Jesus Christ that you will ever find. The application of that begins at 12:1. Don't be conformed to this world. Be transformed. Renew your mind. And in that, you show yourself and the world what God is and who God is.
Absolutely. And you have the cousin to conformity, which is compromise.
Yeah.
Which is just a little bit less than conformity. I'm not going to do everything the world does, but I'm going to compromise a little bit. I think you have a great example of that in the book of Galatians. You know, in the book you have the big overarching issue is you have a bunch of Judaizing teachers who are going out into Christian churches and are telling everybody, hey, you got to be circumcised, you got to follow the law of Moses. And at the end of the book, we actually learn what their motivation was. They're telling people to do this so everybody will think that they're Jews, so that they won't be persecuted. And so ultimately it was a compromise to try to say, oh, we're not going that far, we're not that radical, we're not Christians, so don't persecute us anymore. And we can be guilty of the same thing, can't we?
Yeah, exactly so. It's easy to do that. Other poor ways of responding to our culture as Christians, I think constantly being combative and argumentative. And you understand what I mean by that? I don't mean that we don't take a stand for what's right, but there's a difference between seeing every discussion as one where I have to win and let's discuss and talk and open the Bible and see what it says. I think a wrong response, and I think it's easy doing what Jonathan and I are doing tonight. I think it's very easy. One of the easiest wrong responses to have is just to wring our hands and say with Nicodemus, well, how can these things be?
Yeah.
And just feel like it's hopeless and there's nothing that we can do and that the world is just horrible. And it's not. God's given us an amazing world to live in and to enjoy. There's a lot that's wrong here. But I don't, everything is not gloom and doom and despair. And while I have said twice that I think things feel differently now, and I do think that things are perhaps more off kilter than in the past, it's not all gloom and doom and despair. There is a tremendous amount of good in this world.
And the funny thing about hand-wringing and complaining and everything like that is ultimately it's one of the laziest things that we can do as Christians. And that's what we don't realize. We think, oh, when I walk into Carrie's office and we have a 15-minute long conversation about, can you believe what you saw on the news? What have we really done at the end of the day? When you have a conversation with your wife, can you believe what they're talking about in schools? Can you believe what happened over here? Can you believe what's happening in Ukraine? And we just wring our hands and we think we're doing something. But really, what are we doing? It's laziness dressed up as activity.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point. I wish I had thought of that.
This is why I didn't put it on the outline I gave you.
I noticed that. Okay. All right, there's a question coming your way in a minute. It may hit you upside the head. I don't know. I tell you another wrong way to think about this, and we've touched on it here, and that's isolation. I think sometimes Christians feel like, I've said this, I think sometimes Christians feel like if we could just live in a Christian cocoon where we didn't have to rub elbows with anybody in the world, wouldn't that be great? I've illustrated that saying if we could just have a subdivision that was gated and only Christians were allowed to buy in there, and you got up in the morning, you went to a job and only Christians could work there, and on the way home you went to a Publix where you had to show a card that you were a Christian to get inside, and then go back to your subdivision and go in and close the gate, and you never had to touch any of those nasty, filthy, dirty people in the world, wouldn't that be great? Jesus didn't say it'd be great at all. He said, you're the salt of the earth and light of the world. And Paul said, yes, this is Philippians 2, it is a crooked and perverse generation. And what did he say? Among whom you shine as lights in the world. I think that's so important that we realize that. There's value. The young families in our church, there's value when you're, to interact with parents of other kids in T-ball or soccer or whatever it is, to be involved and to be engaged and let people see what a Christian family looks like and how Christians behave in those kinds of environments.
And I think the funny thing is about living in Temple Terrace, Florida, is that we can isolate ourselves so easily here more than anywhere else. I remember I was here for like a year, and I was really excited one day to go to the park. There were a bunch of people there, and I'm like, I'm going to invite someone to church. And I invited a member of Livingston to church. And that's what happens when you live in Temple Terrace, Florida. And, for people in other places, there aren't that many Christians around, so isolation is not really a possibility, but we can be guilty of that more than anywhere else because of the abundance of Christians that are around.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Let's. I think we probably should move on from that, JB, because we only have about 10 minutes left, and so I think what we just talked about leads into something that you ought to discuss, and that's how we react to that clash of cultures.
Yeah, and I think the word that we ought to think about is the word engage. We don't want to isolate. We don't want to complain. We don't want to run away. We don't want to be combative. We want to engage with the culture. We want to get our hands dirty. We need to grapple with it. I'm thinking about the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 9. Matthew 9, verse 37, then he said to his disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore, beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. And that's what we ought to think about when we think about how we engage with the culture. We're going out in the field to work. And we don't get to pick what field is the field that we work in. This is just the field that our master has sent us out into. And we can waste a lot of time talking about, well, I wish I was in that 18th century field or that first century field. I would have appreciated that. Of course, no one really would because no one wants to get eaten by a lion. But we can spend so much time complaining about what field we're supposed to work in, but we need to engage with the field that we have. We need to understand this is the opportunity God has given us. This is the hand that we've been dealt. And so when we look at our culture, we need to say, okay, there are people out there who do not have the gospel, who are being led astray by all this worldly thinking. And it is my job to reach out there, get my hands dirty, grab hold of them, and try to do something with that. I need to engage the culture, just like a farmer engages the field he's working in.
Yeah, something that illustrates that, I think, perfectly. Think about the way that Jesus dealt with people. When Jesus said, you are the light of the world, you're the salt of the earth, you are the light of the world. Think about the fact that with Jesus, every person who was in front of him, whoever that may have been, he became light to that person's world. Have you ever thought about it in those terms? You're the salt of the earth, the light of the world. Well, I can't illuminate the entirety of the world, right? But with Jesus, whoever he interacted with, he became light to that person. He engaged them in such a way that he became light to them. And if we could just think about that, learn to do that, to realize again that every person you meet is made in the image of God. They are worthy of our time, and they are worthy of our attention. And we have to be a light. We have to be a light to them.
And that's what Ephesians 5 says. Do not participate in the unfruitful deeds of the darkness, but instead even expose them.
Yeah.
And that's what our goal is. We're going out there and we're trying to expose to these blind, lost people in the world. We're trying to show them the gospel that opened our eyes when we were blind and lost too. And so we need to engage the culture, see what the problem is, and put our hands to the work. And that's a good question to ask yourself. And if my life is a field, if my neighbors are stalks of corn, am I working in the field that God has given me to work in? And so the critical question that we really have to ask before we're done, Don, is how do we engage the culture and how are we supposed to go about that specifically?
Yeah. When Jonathan and I were talking about this, and this was I thought a great question that Jonathan came up with. How do we engage our culture? When I began to think about that, I thought about, okay, what example is there in the Bible of someone who found themselves in a culture that was completely foreign to who they were spiritually? And I thought about Daniel and his young friends, these royal captives. They are taken by force and taken to a land where the culture is completely foreign to them. And they are forced to assimilate into an ungodly culture. They are forced to live in an ungodly culture. What's interesting is that at the end of Daniel's life, Daniel's only one of 2 or 3 people in the Bible against whom not a negative word is spoken. You will search your Bible and not find one negative word about Daniel. So how did he survive that? How did he end up in that culture that was so foreign to him in every way and was ungodly? It was a pagan culture in every way. And he had to go through the educational process. He was forced to be educated in the wisdom of the Babylonians, the text says. And he comes out and he's okay spiritually. How was he able to do that? And as I've thought about that, I came up with 4 things. One is optimism. Optimism. Because Daniel knew that God was in control. The text says in Daniel 1 and 2, the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And it seems like Daniel lived with the understanding that if God delivered them into his hand, then God could also deliver them from his hand. And it seems to me he lived with that optimism. And secondly was friendship. He wasn't trying to do this by himself. You know, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego play a very important part, obviously, in the life of Daniel. I've thought many times, if it had only been Daniel, if he had been taken by himself, I wonder how he would have done. Now, maybe he would have done really great. Maybe he would have still done just fine. But surely, the presence of righteous friends to lean on and encourage each other, surely that made a huge difference. And if you don't think that makes a difference to your kids, I would just say you're mistaken. It makes a huge difference, obviously. And third was humility. Humility. Do you ever notice when Daniel speaks to those in authority who really don't care about his God at all, he speaks to them in a respectful way, in a kind way. Again, he treats them as though they're made in the image of God. And then fourth was conviction. Because Daniel had learned the great stories of faith. And so he knew that God had delivered Moses from the Red Sea and David from Goliath and Elijah from the prophets of Baal. And he believed, he had that conviction that God would do the same for them because he had promised that. And he believed that. And so when I was thinking about that, optimism, friendship, humility, conviction, I think those 4 things would serve all of us really, really well in this particular culture.
And the thing that I wanted to add to that, particularly in terms of humility, and I won't speak to all of them because we're running out of time, but I think one thing that Daniel had on his side was it was very obvious what a big challenge he had. You know, he is ripped away from his home, he's transported to Babylon, and he has to live there in that society. And I think that we don't have the humility always to realize that our job on this earth is just as difficult as his was. We have to have the humility to admit that our culture is challenging and that we're affected by it and that we need to be aware of that. One way we survive is by not underestimating what a challenge it is to live in this culture and what a challenge it is for our kids to live in this culture as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. We've only got a couple of minutes left. I want to end tonight, at least my part, and then I want Jonathan to talk a little bit about next Wednesday night. But I want to end my part by I'm going to end this very fast. I think if we're going to thrive, we're talking about Christians in the culture, and if you notice, understanding, surviving, but thriving. Not just understanding and surviving, but we want to thrive in our culture. And I think there are a couple of things that help us with that. And I think these are really important. I hope, just give me one minute here. Number one, don't ask God to change the world until you've asked God to change you. Don't ask God to change this world until you've asked God to change you. We got to make sure that we're salt and light before we try to transform others. We can't change others if we've not been transformed into the image of God's Son. And secondly, don't run from people. Run to people. This is what Jonathan was talking about a minute ago with this business of isolation. Ladies and gentlemen, non-Christians are not arguments to be won. They are souls to be saved. And we've got to make sure that we see them that way. Non-Christians are not arguments to be won. They are souls to be saved. Lives are messy. And it's easier sometimes to run away from messy lives. But again, think about people Jesus engaged with. I mean, there was a woman taken in adultery. There was a woman at the well who had multiple broken relationships. There was a demon-possessed man in Matthew chapter 5. Those were all messy lives. And the people that we interact with who aren't Christians, they're going to have messy lives too. Many of them have how many people do you know who have just flown through multiple marriages, or they've struggled with something in their life, or they've been ingrained in some horrible habit or dishonesty or lies. And then third, don't be conformed to this world. Be transformed. That goes back to what we said in Romans 12 and verse 1. Okay, we've got just a minute. Jonathan, next week we've got Keith Stormont coming. Our folks don't know Keith Stormont, but
I don't either.
Well, listen, this was your idea, so.
His name is Keith Stoneheart.
Stoneheart. See, I don't know it. Don't know it.
I do know some.
Please don't tell him next Wednesday that I didn't know his name. Okay, Keith Stoneheart. All right.
If you don't ask me to pay for this, I won't tell him.
Okay, all right.
All right. So Keith Stonehart's coming to us. He's from Fultondale, Alabama, and Keith really has a fascinating story. He grew up outside of the church, and he lived his life wild and crazy, just as much like the prodigal son in our days as you can possibly imagine. And he's now a Christian and a preacher today, and he just has a wonderful story and a wonderful testimony about that. He's going to be coming, and he's going to talk to us about representing Jesus on social media. And I think that's especially important when we think about Christians in the culture, because social media is the modern day Areopagus. This is where many times we do engage the culture. And so thinking about how we represent ourselves and represent our Savior on social media is extremely important. So be here next Wednesday for Keith Stoneheart.
Stoneheart. Okay, and here's the deal, Jonathan. I will give you $100 if you will cut your hair like Keith Stonehart's for next Wednesday night.
Deal.
Okay. All right. It has to be just like his.
You have to check that with the elders first, though. They have not approved that.
I think they'd be okay with a mohawk. I think so. We'll see. Thank you all for listening so well tonight.